Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 4, Dragon Chapters 7 and 8. Hitoshi sat down and looked over the table at the person who was going to question him. It was an older man and he just wore a shirt and pants. He didn't appear special, which was. Hitoshi wasn't sure what it meant at the moment. Usually we wouldn't do this, the man said without preamble. But given the current situation, he shrugged and then appeared to want an answer. Hitoshi didn't sigh, though he wanted to. Aizawa had warned him there'd be games within games and that he'd have to play at least one level of them. It's a special situation, he replied. The man gave him a look and then nodded. We want to preempt any questions, he explained. Hitoshi returned the nod. And we want to help him, the man continued. For a moment Hitoshi didn't understand and then he nodded. He knew how this went. The official line wasn't trotted out much because most villains were older, but there had been a few who were tagged that way officially when they were young. Then the Hero Public Safety Commission always said the same thing. He wanted to brace himself to say it but knew he couldn't. If he did that, then they'd know he was lying. Instead, Hitoshi blew out a small breath and half closed his eyes as he nodded and looked down at the table. I understand. The sooner Izuku can be brought in, he paused, making a face as he considered. The less time he will have had to commit crimes, and he shook his head. Hopefully they won't be that bad, so the punishment won't need to be that bad, he said with a slightly hopeful note in his voice. Exactly, the man said. Now, let's start, he added. What is your name? Hitoshi Shinsu, he replied. Age? 16. Quirk? While they weren't meant to ask about his quirk, he knew this question had been coming. These days, the standard set of questions always included information about your quirk. Reaction-based brainwashing, Hitoshi said. Aizawa had counseled that it would be better than saying brainwashing. Adding the two words somehow made his quirk seem far less dangerous because it implied there were conditions. There were conditions, but most people considered them to be dangerously easy to achieve. But until someone knew what the conditions were, the words acted as a protection. The underground hero had explained it was all about perception. Your occupation? High school student. Where? UA, first year, General Studies course. The man nodded at him. Hitoshi didn't react. He knew these basic questions were to establish a baseline. How long have you known Izuku Midoriya? Also known as Maite Chui or Izuku Chui? Since I was 8, Hitoshi said, and did not volunteer any further information. That had been another of Aizawa's instructions. The man had told him to answer the questions but to do nothing more. Hitoshi hadn't needed an explanation as to why that was best. How did you meet him? Izuku walked up to me one lunchtime and said he wanted to be friends, Hitoshi answered. It was a little bit more complicated than that. He still remembered being confronted by a giant of a man the day before, but essentially that is what had happened. Just like that? The man seemed skeptical. Just like that, Hitoshi confirmed. We were 8. There didn't need to be other formalities, he added somewhat sarcastically. The man stared at him for a moment before he nodded. The pause made Hitoshi wonder if the guy was wired. Had someone just reminded him that kids made friends easily? Unless something else, far more obvious happened, Hitoshi decided he probably wouldn't know. Or be able to work it out. What did you think of him? What do you mean? Hitoshi asked. That was another thing Aizawa had told him after making him run around the training field. If there was an open or vague question, then he was allowed to ask for clarification. While he was being questioned, he wasn't charged with anything or even under undue suspicion. There was obviously some suspicion since he was being questioned, but they knew he wasn't a villain. The underground hero had reminded him that they couldn't treat him as a villain. The nebulous they might like to, but they couldn't. What were your impressions of Izuku? The man clarified. He seemed sincere, Hitoshi explained. He knew about my quirk and said that didn't matter, he added. He really didn't want to mention his quirk again, but he also knew the HPSC would have been able to find out quite easily that people had been suspicious of it. These days people didn't really consider that, because he had friends, but when he was alone, they automatically assumed he was alone because he had driven away his friends using his quirk on them. People were idiots. Your parents moved when he did. How did that happen? I don't know exactly, but they were after a sea change, Hitoshi said. Apparently the guy was happy to leave that question there. He'd said nothing but the truth. He didn't know, but he remembered his parents had told him they wanted to move. He was pretty sure that so long as he continued to tell them the truth, then they would have to accept that, though Hitoshi was curious if the person with the truth detection quirk was the guy or someone watching. So you have been friends with Izuku Midoriya continuously since you were 8? Yes, Hitoshi acknowledged. Did you know his father was a villain? Not then, I didn't. That acknowledged that he now knew Izuku's father was a villain but didn't tell them exactly when he'd found that out. It might only be a few days early, during All Might's fight, that he'd worked it out, but those few days were important. The rest of the world hadn't known that man was Izuku's father until later. The guy appeared surprised. Hitoshi remained silent. Did they think that Izuku's dad went around announcing that he was a villain? That was stupid. When did you find out? He hadn't really wanted to answer that question, but he could still be vague. With what happened now, Hitoshi said, and was glad that he sounded calm. The man gave him a sharp look, and Hitoshi knew he wasn't going to be able to keep being vague about the timeline. When exactly? The night of All Might's fight. There was no point in trying to deny it. Aizawa had been clear on what would happen if they thought he was lying. Why didn't you report Izuku? What do you mean? Hitoshi said. Your friend is a kidnap victim, the man said. I didn't know that then, Hitoshi told them. He hadn't. He'd only learned that later. I didn't know he was Izuku Midoriya until the Yaoyorozu interview. He offered the information freely. Reluctantly, Hitoshi could see that the guy had to accept that. So why didn't you report Izuku as a villain then? What type of dumb question was that? That implied that Izuku was always going to be a villain. Hitoshi shouldn't be surprised now. He knew how the world worked. Because he hadn't done anything. But he was going to. No, he wasn't. Hitoshi snapped back before realizing the answer had been a mistake. How do you know? The man seized on the information. Hitoshi gritted his teeth. This was something personal to Izuku, and he didn't feel right revealing it, but he knew he had to. He took a deep breath and met the man's eyes. Just before our last year of middle school, Izuku's father let him go. Let him go? The guy's tone was clearly doubtful. Let him go, Hitoshi repeated. He told Izuku to go into the world and make his own decision. Oh, come on. There is no way. Izuku believed it, Hitoshi said before the guy could say anything further. That shut him up, and Hitoshi watched as he obviously bit the inside of his lip. Even if Izuku's father didn't mean for Izuku to make a choice. For the line of questioning they were taking, all that mattered was what Izuku believed. Very well, the man said before fixing him with a look. Hitoshi braced. He didn't know the exact question that was coming, but he had a fair idea. And what do you think of Izuku Midoriya's actions now? He knew what they wanted him to say here, but Hitoshi also knew he'd be lying if he said that. Hitoshi allowed himself to sigh now. I'm conflicted, he said finally, knowing he couldn't remain silent forever. The man nodded, as if to acknowledge the truth of his statement but also to indicate he should continue. The public punishment given to Ochako Uraraka far outweighed the supposed crime, especially when compared to the public punishment given to Kaminari, Hitoshi explained. Ochako had been expelled from UA for supposedly just knowing Izuku, while Kaminari, and others, had traveled to an active hero raid and then used his quirk on national television. It was beyond vigilantism. The man said nothing. Hitoshi was kind of thankful for that, because even if they tried to claim there were other things going on that they weren't aware of, without details of those other things, the punishment was extreme. But taking their quirks is not going to help Ochako. And going to be a villain is not going to change the system, he continued, but added the words by itself in his mind. That way he was completely truthful, but he had no idea if it would work. He could only hope that the person reading his honesty wasn't only based on his words. He thought it would be okay since there were other ways of telling if a person was lying. The system? The man asked. The system, Hitoshi confirmed but knew what he was asking. No system is perfect, he explained. The current hero system could use some improvements. The guy looked at him almost disbelieving before his expression morphed slightly. It became the type of expression adults gave children who were too young to know better. If Izuku came out and said that his real quirk was one that allowed him to take other people's quirks permanently, he'd be called a villain, whether he was one or not. I know what that's like, Hitoshi explained. The man remained silent. Hitoshi hoped that was for the best. But it's not. He huffed. It's not a reason to go out and actually become a villain, Hitoshi concluded. That was true. Your quirk alone shouldn't be why you became a villain, but it was the reason at least some people did become villains. At least in society's eyes, so Hitoshi wasn't lying with that statement. It took the guy a moment to realize that, and he nodded. Hitoshi waited for the next question, but nothing came and silence stretched between them. He sat quietly, not sure if they wanted him to say something more, something that might be incriminating, or if they, those he hadn't seen, were debating his answers. The man sat as well, and Hitoshi took the opportunity to examine him. He was dressed simply and didn't appear to have any mutation. If he was wired, then that was well hidden, and he didn't have the air of someone who was listening to a conversation, so if the others were discussing him, they were not broadcasting it. A minute passed, and then they moved into the second. Hitoshi was reminded how time crawled when in silence. There were times when it flew, but for now it was crawling. He was kind of amused when the man started fidgeting. "My name is Jinsha," the man told Hitoshi. He nodded a response, but the name didn't mean anything to him. "I'm not the one who can tell if you are lying," he added. "Ah," Hitoshi smiled. "So they are discussing things?" "I think so," Jinsha said with a shrug. "Eraserhead must like you," Jinsha added. "What do you mean?" The guy smiled. "Eraserhead must like you," he repeated. "He obviously spoke to you about how to answer, and what we were expecting." Hitoshi shrugged. He wouldn't deny it, but he didn't have to confirm it exactly. "He wouldn't have bothered if he didn't like you," Jinsha explained. "Oh, that was interesting to hear. The underground hero had been." Hitoshi knew he'd been peeved that he'd been instructed to take him on as an apprentice, but he also knew the underground hero would take it seriously. But it was interesting to hear that something he'd done must have made an impression on the man. "I'll make sure to thank him," Hitoshi said. Jinsha gave him a slightly disbelieving look before he laughed. "You do that," he encouraged before he sighed. "Given the time this is taking, I think you've put the cat among the pigeons." "I didn't lie." "Oh, I don't think you did," Jinsha agreed. I don't know what they were looking for." There wasn't anything he could say to that, and so Hitoshi just nodded and remained silent. Again there was silence between them, but this didn't seem as difficult, and while it was long, it didn't stretch as it had earlier. Then Jinsha shifted slightly, and Hitoshi knew he was listening to something. "If Izuku asked you to help him, what would you do?" The question came suddenly. Hitoshi blinked. He knew he had to answer truthfully. "I'd help him, but I'd also tell the heroes," he finished forcefully. "At the very least I'd want to hear him out," he explained. Jinsha nodded at his answer and went silent. Hitoshi hoped that answer wasn't going to ruin things. But if Izuku asked him for help, he would want to do it. "All right, you are good to go," Jinsha said suddenly, faster than Hitoshi would have expected given the answer he'd just given. "Just like that?" Hitoshi asked with a frown. "Just like that," Jinsha shrugged. For a moment Hitoshi hesitated, wondering if he should ask something before he realized it was obvious. Anyone in his position, or rather, the position they wanted him to be in, would be wanting reassurance that their apprenticeship wasn't in danger. "What about?" He paused, as if unsure how to phrase things delicately. "What about?" Jinsha prompted. "What about my apprenticeship?" Hitoshi asked, sounding worried. He was worried. He didn't know what he wanted to do in the future, but the apprenticeship would give him options and would give him insights into the hero industry that couldn't be made from outside. "There's no change," Jinsha told him. Hitoshi felt himself relax at that and nodded. "If Izuku approaches you, tell Eraserhead immediately and he will let the appropriate authorities know," Jinsha said before he gave a small huff. "And I would do that, if I were you." "Your friend?" Jinsha shook his head. "He's not your friend anymore." "He might want to be," but he sighed heavily. "I don't think he's the person you knew anymore." Hitoshi frowned. "What do you mean?" Jinsha looked at him for a few seconds before he shook his head. "I can't say," he said. But he paused. "I can't say he was lying to you the entire time you knew him, because you knew him since you were 8, and he wouldn't have been lying then. But now, he's not the friend you once knew, and it would be better if you thought of Izuku Midoriya as a different person from the Izuku you knew." Hitoshi swallowed and then forced himself to nod. Izuku had said he hadn't really said much, but apparently he'd been busier than he'd indicated. But that was the way things were going to be. I don't think he'll ask me for anything," Hitoshi said. "He might," Jinsha replied immediately. Hitoshi didn't frown, but he wondered what information he didn't have. Or were the heroes thinking that because Izuku was young, he'd make simple mistakes? That seemed like something they would do. In which case he didn't smile or roll his eyes, but it was a close thing. If that was the case, then the Hero Public Safety Commission were underestimating Izuku and they'd pay the price. He'd just have to wait and see. Shunin rolled his eyes as he listened to the other lawyer. He'd gotten his client off, and now the other kid's lawyer somehow expected him to do something too. Geez. The man knew how things worked. He hadn't been paid to deal with the other kid, just the spider-quirked teen. Look, he said sharply, cutting through the drivel he wasn't listening to. Your client, what's his name? Shunin asked. Nobasu Yubikoto, came the reply. Yeah, him. Just play on the fact he was bullied by that Bakugo kid and settle for a restraining order and some community service. It's not like he did any permanent damage, did he? Shunin advised. He wants to get off entirely, the other lawyer complained. That's not going to happen, Shunin huffed. I got that Gatarui kid off, 'cause he didn't do anything. Nobasu did. Just tell him that's the best he can hope for, and if he's too dumb to accept that, then walk away, he said. Shunin shook his head. He was beginning to regret taking that case, but, while the alliance didn't exactly have terms, when their biggest client asked for something to be done, they did it. Other law firms couldn't buy out the alliance, but he sighed softly. He shouldn't be this annoyed. That particular client always paid well and got him cases against the HPSC. So he shouldn't be picky. Not all of us can walk away from a client, the other lawyer told him. Of course we can, Shunin objected. It's all in how you phrase it, he advised. Anyway, I'm not saying more on your case. You know what to do, he added before he hung up. If this had been a regular case, then it was open and shut. It wasn't, and that was probably what his compatriot was struggling with. But, it wasn't his case, and it wasn't like he cared about them. He'd done his job and he hadn't heard if his client was happy, but he assumed they were. They'd paid, which really, along with cases against the HPSC, was all he cared about. Kenshin Naruhado, principal of Shiketsu High School, looked at the invitation. It was on paper and handwritten. The archaic style was. Sometimes Nezu was just too obvious with his warnings. What do you think of it? Kenshin asked Koi. The teacher wasn't the vice principal but was someone Kenshin relied on. Koi Sasum had seen a lot in her history. She wasn't a hero and had never been one. Instead, she'd been a manager, and over the course of her active management career, she'd seen humanity and heroes at their best and worst. She'd managed heroes through lethal force authorization, and she'd managed them when those went wrong, resulting in the deaths of civilians or, less frequently but often enough to be known of, the death of the hero. She'd seen a lot and knew how to read the situation. They are taking Izuku Midoriya seriously, she said softly. He gave her a look. That wasn't what he was looking for. There's a lot of messages there, she told him, slightly defensively. He sighed and gestured for her to continue. They are taking Izuku Midoriya seriously. Nezu is concerned about the commission. UA is concerned about their reputation and the public perception of heroes, especially after All Might's battle with that villain. Pick one? She instructed. Kenshin chuckled. Is this a good idea? He asked. Depends what we want out of it, Koi countered. That was the question. Shiketsu, as a school, had a vested interest in ensuring that their students were prepared for the future, and that was their focus. They were not, or not meant to be, directly involved in actually fighting villains, so the request was interesting in that way. He had no objections to preparing his students to fight the next generation of villains, but there seemed to be a good chance that his students would now be exposed to fighting villains, and he wasn't sure what he thought of that. On the other hand, UA didn't appear to have a choice in the matter. The villains seemed to come to them. He couldn't help but wonder if that was a consequence of having All Might there, or if the villains would have attacked anyway. If we go in with this, it will expose us, he murmured. Yes, but that might not be a bad thing, Koi countered. He didn't need to tell her to explain. Koi didn't look happy, but Kenshin got the impression her disapproval wasn't with him. These new villains, she began carefully. They aren't like the ones most of our students will encounter, she explained. You know as well as I do that most villains are in need of assistance. They can get that assistance after being arrested. There are some bad eggs, she continued. Those who are truly villainous, who just want to hurt people, but those aren't the regular type. And these new ones? This Tomura Shigaraki and Izuku Midoriya? Kenshin asked. Tomura had been making his name attacking UA. Supposedly going after All Might. His name had been cemented in the underworld by the fact that a villain, they were calling All for One, had come to defend him. Even through television screens, there had been something malevolent about All for One and the population knew it. As for Izuku Midoriya, his reputation had been cemented by the Yaoyorozu's very public plea for him to return their daughter's quirk. Some people were more afraid of Izuku than Tomura. They pointed out that Tomura simply went after All Might, who, while obviously grievously injured, was a hero. Izuku had gone after quirks. And no one was quite sure what to think about that. They're different, she agreed. They are not after something they immediately need. They are more dangerous than that, because they are after social change. Koi seemed to think about that for a few moments. Social change by itself is not a bad thing. It's necessary, she pointed out. But the type of violent upheaval they want isn't good. At least in Tomura's case. Izuku hasn't said anything. He killed that woman in Niigata. Kenshin objected. A woman he had a history with, Koi reminded him. And there is no doubt that is a bad thing and he will be punished for it, but I do not believe that is a representation of his desires, she explained. And yes, I know he's behind the kidnapping of the gang that attacked his friend and he's probably killed them too, she continued before he could object. But again, that was a personal attack. We've yet to see Izuku perform any ACTs that relate to his overall goal. So he's just a villain, driven by his passions, Kenshin stated. For the moment, Koi agreed, but he could read the doubt in her voice. You don't think he's going to remain that? She shook her head. UA wouldn't be worried about him, even with his ability to take quirks, if he was just a teenager acting on his desires, she pointed out. That was true. So why should Shiketsu participate in this? He asked, poking at the invitation. Koi sighed and picked up the invitation. She flicked her eyes over it. I don't think we have a choice, she indicated. It represents a great opportunity for our students, Koi said. Oh, I can see that, Kenshin said. While UA was asking for them to send only 3 students, for those 3 it would be a great opportunity to train with All Might and to network with other up-and-coming heroes. Nezu's specific wording made it clear he wanted the best of their students. As educators, we develop a sense for those who are going to go far, who have the drive, and the will to be the very best. UA seeks those students, of any year level, to participate in a long-term training exercise, led by All Might, to mold the heroes of the future. Yeah, he'd been clear, though the rat hadn't said anything about which school the students would represent once they were through with this training exercise. Even if Nezu didn't mention combat, he could see that was the intent. Think of the social implications if we don't participate, Koi instructed. Kenshin didn't grimace, but it was a close thing. Those would be large. He could probably come up with a reason to hold back Shiketsu's students if it was just training on the grounds that it was likely to be attacked by villains and his students weren't ready. But it was a holdover from the unrest that accompanied the rise of quirks, but those institutions which trained heroes, those who the community would rely on to protect them, were also shelters for those communities. In case of civil unrest, such as the unrest it appeared Tomura Shigaraki was fomenting, they were obligated to protect civilians. Shiketsu's grounds, like UAS and other hero schools, had shelters for that reason. Nezu's proposal was meant to show the hero schools working together to prepare the next generation of heroes. That's what the sales pitch to the public would say, and if Shiketsu was not involved, then Kenshin sighed. If they weren't involved, then there'd be questions about what else they wouldn't do. I hate that rat, he grumbled. Koi didn't look sympathetic. He knew the feeling at least partially mutual for her, but she was far better at controlling it. So, which students? She asked pragmatically. Shiketsu did not have a big 3, as UA liked to boast. Instead, Shiketsu liked to say they had a rounded student body that didn't overly rely on individuals. But they did know that some of their students would do better than others. They were all going to be good heroes, but some. Darn that rat. Some would be great. Given that they are likely to go straight into combat, the 3rd years, Kenshin said as he thought. He could think of 2 immediately, but he wasn't sure of the others. Koi nodded but said nothing. He got the impression she was prepared to wait for his answer. He hated when she got like this. How about Keiko and Sakai? Kenshin asked. Those weren't the 2 he was thinking of, and he wondered if she'd pick that up. The glare she gave him spoke volumes. All right, Kenshin sighed. Taiki and Amy, he said the two names. Taiki was a muscular male student whose quirk was a stock standard strength quirk. It was rather boring, but also rather useful. Amy had a limited water manipulation quirk, combined with the ability to breathe underwater. It made her quite flexible with missions. Especially since she trained and was no wilting flower. They were both at the top of the third years. Not Miyako? Koi asked. Kenshin acknowledged her question with a nod. I think she's going to be a better underground hero, he explained, and I get the impression that Nezu's after fighters, he added. He saw her glance at the letter. It didn't say anything specifically, but she sighed and he knew she agreed. The third, Koi said, tapping one finger on the table. That's the problem. Kenshin agreed. They sat in silence for a few moments. What abo? Koi fell silent without finishing. About? Naruhado prompted. One of the first years, Koi said slowly, as if she was still thinking. The first years? He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Nezu will be sending his, Koi countered, but Kenshin could tell she agreed with him. Not all of them, he argued. The quirkless, she agreed. They'll need protecting, but the fact remains, Nezu is sending them. Kenshin sighed. He couldn't argue that. Which first year? He asked instead. They did still need a third. Anasa, Koi told him. Anasa? The kid who was meant to go to UA? He murmured. He'd considered not accepting the application, but the teen had proved he was dedicated, at least for now. Shadowcrawler and Maginetti were more than a little annoyed at that, Koi told him. Yeah, so? It takes a lot of guts to go against your mentors that way. Koi pointed out. Kenshin huffed. That's just teenage drama, he dismissed it. Magnetti and Shadowcrawler might have used some favors to get Anasa a chance at UA recommendation, but they'd live. Perhaps, but he's got. Koi paused and then huffed. Nezu's right, you know. You get a sense for who is going to go far. He's going to make it. He might even be number one at some point, she said seriously. You've told others this? Of course not. She snapped. But I was going to recommend we allow him to take the provisional license exam. From her, that was a serious recommendation. Bring me everyone's files. If I can't find someone else, we'll recommend those three, but. I don't like it either, Koi told him, but, if we send anything but the best. She didn't have to say anything more. If Shiketsu sent anything less than their best, then, UA would count that as a win. And he wasn't going to let them win. Sugimoto Kabuto looked at the invitation. It had come as a surprise in his mail. Izumu Hero High did not get too many letters. Well, not on paper. Especially not from UA. The arrangements for the visitation program were taken care of electronically. He'd already read the letter and it was troubling and hopeful in many ways, and while what it asked for was simple, he wasn't sure. What do you think? He asked Sumino as he held out the letter. She was one of the hero teachers, and if they went ahead with it, she would most likely accompany their students. She took the paper with iridescent nails and spent several moments reading it. It was a bit disconcerting watching her read because she had no pupils or irises. As part of her quirk, she took in light from all of her eyes. Still, he knew what she was reading. Dear Sugimoto. In light of recent events, UA feels that training of tomorrow's heroes would be served by bringing them together. While the rankings of the Hero Billboard will put our students into competition with each other, in true hero work, there is no ranking. As such, it is felt, to meet the new wave of villains, already emerging in Japan, it would be best to train the heroes of tomorrow to work together so that they can effectively and efficiently meet the challenge they represent. UA is extending an invitation to all hero schools around the country to participate. The UA campus will be designated for the training, which is anticipated to run for several months and will provide all meals and accommodation to the chosen students and their accompanying teacher. While the UA campus is extensive, I ask that Isamu Hero High limit their selection to 3 students and offer the following advice for their selection. As educators, we develop a sense for those who are going to go far, who have the drive and the will to be the very best. UA seeks those students, of any year level, to participate in a long-term training exercise, led by All Might, to mold the heroes of the future. Responses are expected in 3 weeks, and questions can be directed to my office. You have the number. Nezu. Principal, UA Hero High. It's interesting, Sumino replied at length. I was hoping for something a little more in-depth than that. Sugimoto said. She shifted slightly to make it clear she was looking at him. No, you were wanting me to verify your belief, Sumino said blandly. Maybe I was hoping you'd disagree? No, she said certainly. He sighed. I want us to participate, Sugimoto said softly. Sumino did not look convinced. I do want us to participate, he objected to her look. But? Sumino prompted. He reached out and took the letter again. As educators, we develop a sense for those who are going to go far. Who have the drive, and the will to be the very best, he quoted. What about it? Sumino questioned. When was the last time that Isamu Hero High produced a graduate who got to the top? He asked seriously, though couldn't help the sad note in his tone. To be fair, with All Might taking the top spot, no one has, Sumino told him, but he could tell she understood his question. It's been a while, she admitted. It's been more than a while, Sugimoto corrected. Isamu Hero High turned out good heroes. No one denied that. But they were not great heroes. None of their graduates had gotten close to the top in the rankings. Their graduates were necessary heroes. They kept the small fry villains under control and had solid, good careers and saved a lot of people, but Isamu Hero High was not one of the top-ranked schools. If we still had Raid Kikiru, I'd consider it, Sumino said, nodding to the letter which was now sitting between them on his desk. Raid had graduated 2 years back. We don't. Sugimoto indicated with a nod to show he agreed anyway. So you write back to Nezu, and tell him we regret that we don't have any suitable students but that we will support the initiative? I think so. I want to participate, but, he shook his head. We just don't have anyone who could compete, and I feel if we sent our students then they'd be crushed, Sumino agreed softly. Sugimoto snorted slightly. We always knew we were second tier to UA. It's just that. Usually Nezu doesn't point it out, she finished for him. Is not even doing that here, Sugimoto said. It's just that. How about we just say no and move on? Sumino asked. For a moment, he wanted to explain, to argue, but there was no point. They both knew the truth, they couldn't compete on this, and if they tried, they'd be putting their students in danger they weren't prepared or equipped to cope with. If only I was a few years younger, Sugimoto joked instead. While Sumino couldn't physically roll her eyes, she gave the impression that she had. If only, she replied with mock sadness. If only, he repeated, and then reached out to pick up the letter, folding it and putting it back in the envelope before he put it in his desk drawer. There was no point in looking further. They already had enough if onlys. End. The Emperor's Dragon Part 4, Dragon, Chapters 7 and 8. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe. Join me for the next chapters. Or check out my other works.